Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Mr. Tanner, and today we're going to be talking about parts of experiments. And these are the parts of a scientific experiment that you need to be able to identify in order to understand someone else's experiment or design your own experiment well. And the first part of looking at this is understanding variables. And variables are anything that can change during your experiment. So things that can vary or change during your experiment are called variables. And in a well-designed experiment, there's two main types of variables. There's an independent variable, and a dependent variable. And we're going to talk about each of those types below. So an independent variable and a dependent variable. The independent variable causes the dependent variable to change. So science experiments are really hoping to find a cause and effect type scenario, and the independent variable should cause the dependent variable to change. And a trick to help you identify this in an experiment is the independent variable is what we or the experimenter changes on purpose. What we change rather on purpose. Change on purpose. If you wanted to graph your data, which we'll do below, then you would place the independent variable on the x-axis of a graph, and we're going to look at what that means more below. But just know that the independent variable is placed on the x-axis of a graph. The dependent variable, alternatively, the dependent variable is what changes as a result of that independent variable. Independent variable. And again, there is a trick to finding this in an experiment. The dependent variable is usually what we measure. So let's pause here for a second and think about the paper airplane experiment that you did during the green circle activities. You had to change something on purpose, right? Our independent variable that we changed on purpose was the type of airplane that you made. We changed how wide the wings were on our airplanes. You had one that was narrow and one that was wide. The dependent variable of that experiment was how far the airplanes flew. Again, that was what you were measuring in paces or walking out steps. So that experiment, even though we didn't talk about it ahead of time, had an independent variable, the type of airplane, and a dependent variable, how far those airplanes flew. And again, when it comes to graphing a dependent variable, it would be placed on the y-axis. So it would be placed on the y-axis. And if we're taking a look at this little graph that I drew down here, let's label those axes to help keep track of them. The x-axis is always the horizontal axis. This horizontal axis here is our x-axis. So we would label this one x-axis. The y-axis is the vertical axis. And I can help remember this by remembering that on a y, the tail of the y goes up and down. So y-axis. Every good chart needs a title. We'll just call this paper airplanes. And then we need to label our x and y axes. And if you remember or look at your notes, the independent variable goes on the x-axis. So we would label this type of airplane. So that independent variable goes on the x-axis. There was two types. There was a narrow airplane and a wide airplane. Those are our two types. On the y-axis goes the dependent variable, and that was distance, it's a bad D, distance flown. So how far those airplanes actually flew. And I'm just going to make up a couple data points here. We'll say that the narrow airplane flew further, right, a taller bar than the wide airplane. So that's how you would graph this. The independent variable goes on the x-axis, the type of airplane in this case, and the dependent variable goes on the y-axis, the distance flown. In a good experiment, other than the things that change, there also needs to be several things that cannot change. Because if they did change, you don't know why the dependent variable changed. So let's take a look at those really quick. In science, we call these things that cannot change constants because they need to remain constant. So constants are parts of the experiment that must stay the same. So if we were thinking about our paper airplane experiment, if we threw one airplane inside and one airplane outside where it was windy, we wouldn't know if the airplane traveled further because of the wind or because of the shape that the airplane was. Alternatively, if you threw one airplane really soft and the other airplane really hard, we wouldn't know if it traveled further because of the shape of the airplane or because of the difference in how you threw it. So the constants in this scenario could be where you threw the airplane, again indoors in the hallway, and how you threw the airplane, making sure that you throw them as close to exactly the same as possible. So to reiterate that, by keeping everything but the independent variable the same, we know why the dependent variable is changing. So if everything about that paper airplane experiment in those two throws was exactly the same except for the type of airplane, then we know the reason that the distance traveled was different is because of the type of airplane, not due to any other factor. Well, that is going to do it for our notes on independent variable, dependent variable on constants. You're going to be watching another YouTube video to hopefully help clarify any confusion that you have on this. But as always, feel free to ask myself or any other students questions if this isn't quite making sense to you. Other than that, see you guys until next time.